All 5 of these negotiation skills were put to good use in South Africa. In the early 1990s, South Africa as a nation faced a terrible challenge. They sought to negotiate a peaceful transition from the apartheid regime of the last 40 or 50 years to a democracy that would be acceptable to blacks and whites alike. Many thought the task was hopeless. I myself had been there a dozen times, was not at all sure. I was saying it's a 60-40 proposition, and I'm not sure which way has the 60. The 2 chief negotiators represented the government of South Africa and the African National Congress. Listen as I review with them those negotiations. Watch the 5 basic skills in action. South Africa's new national anthem is 2 songs sung back to back. The former anthem of the ANC, the African National Congress, sung in Zulu, and the former national anthem of the Union of South Africa, sung in Afrikaans. In a country torn apart by apartheid for half a century, these are songs of hope, symbols of progress toward building a new, unified, democratic South Africa.
We have a new constitution in our country because of your sacrifices. You are the strength behind the struggle for reconstruction and development in our country.
The road to reconciliation has been long. The negotiations that led to the present democratic government were preceded by decades of violence. In the 1950s, the ruling National Party of the Afrikaners, South Africa's Dutch settlers, formally established the apartheid system. Blacks could live only in certain designated areas and were denied the vote. Opposition political parties were outlawed, and black activists imprisoned, exiled, or sometimes murdered. Racism and violence were the order of the day.
F.W. de Klerk is no longer president in that office because of your struggle.
Years of protest and international sanctions finally led to historic negotiations, which began in secret between the government and ANC leader Nelson Mandela, a political prisoner for 27 years.
The steps that have been decided are the following. The prohibition of the African National Congress.
Newly elected President F.W. de Klerk surprised the world by dismantling segregation laws and legalizing the ANC. Mandela was freed, and serious talks began. Former Mine Workers Union head Cyril Ramaphosa was named chief negotiator for the ANC. His government counterpart was former Defense Minister Rolf Meyer. Their task was to craft a new constitution and a government structure that would heal as well as work.
What we experienced over the last 5 years in South Africa, and what we at the personal level between the 2 of us experienced was totally extraordinary as far as South African history and experience is concerned, because never really did white and black spoke to each other in the past.
Coming from 2 completely different backgrounds, 2 completely different histories, and representing organizations that had completely different strategic objectives. When analyzed fully, we found that there was a vision that we could share, a common vision which was to resolve the apartheid problem and to introduce democracy in our country.
As chief co-problem solvers, opening lines of communication and finding common interests were key from the start. They became important principles that kept talks on track despite seemingly insurmountable differences.
Without compromising the issues that you stand for and without compromising yourself, it is possible to have a relationship with your adversary and be able to even reach a settlement, because you begin to see the problem from a more or less similar perspective.
Building a relationship of trust between blacks and whites nationally began one-on-one with the negotiators.
If I now look back at the whole process, the aspect of personal relationship was probably one of the most important facets of the process.
There were times when, during the negotiations, there were tensions, and we didn't see eye to eye on a number of issues. And we always said, there is no problem without a solution. And after that, we found trust developing on an ongoing basis.
Their relationship began nearly a year before with a fishing trip.
Now, Cyril is in fact a very keen trout fisherman. I unfortunately am not. But in the process, a certain incident occurred where a hook landed up in my finger. This man took a set of pliers and pulled out the hook, but that was only after pouring me half a glass of whiskey, which showed to me that he was also probably not that confident about his skills. But I will never forget when it was all finished, everybody around said, "Well, Cyril, you did it." And my first observation was, and I remarked that too, was, well, I trusted him to do it.
That trust would be called upon repeatedly to deal with tough issues dividing former adversaries and to dispel years of fear built up between blacks and whites. What were the fears of the National Party as you went into these negotiations?
The surrender of power by the white minority in favor of a so-called black majority. That was essentially what the fear was always in the minds of the majority of white people in this country. And quite frankly, in the period of apartheid, they were trained actually to believe and to fear a black majority rule for this country.
We spent many hours in the ANC just talking about the fears, the concerns of the National Party, of white people in this country. And we're convinced that, yes, we needed to address those fears and concerns.
Did you believe that Rolf understood the interests of the black majority of the ANC, that he really understood?
What he did understand fully is that minority rule had to come to an end. In this respect, I believed in what he said. So where he possibly did not understand fully, I filled the gaps for him, gave much more understanding. And where I didn't understand the side of the table he was coming from, what the concerns were, what the fears were, he filled it all up for me. And together we were able to develop what one could call a full picture.
That meant seeing and truly understanding the reasoning that underlay the other side's interests.
Yes, literally, almost it means you have to put yourself in the shoes of the other person and the other party.
But even as relationships were developing, talks floundered. The ANC believed the government was inciting the increasing black-on-black violence that was erupting in the townships.
We were clear in our minds that these people had been killed as part of the program, agenda of the government to destabilize the ANC. And they were doing this to weaken the ANC, we were convinced. And also, they were refusing at the negotiating table to accept the concept of majority rule.
I was watching one evening on the television news, the 8 o'clock news, how Mr. Mandela and Cyril were announcing the total breakdown of negotiations between them and the government. And I was watching him, and I said to myself, damn it, where do we go now? And 15 minutes later, my telephone rang, and it was Cyril on the other side, and he said, when can we talk?
I called him, but he forgets what I was calling him about.
What were you calling him about?
I was calling him to tell him the list of our demands.
Public talks were off, but Ramaphosa and Mayer kept the lines of communication open, meeting privately in what became known as the Channel.
If it were not for that, I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure whether we would have had a peaceful settlement.
Publicly, the ANC mounted mass actions to pressure the government to meet their demands. The ANC wanted the release of political prisoners and protection against the violence of the Inkatha Freedom Party, a predominantly Zulu group that the government had secretly supported.
I think what followed there was actually this real trust-building exercise. In essence, I think we've never up to that point, interestingly, from a negotiating point of view, have actually built the kind of credibility that was required. And looking back at it, as strange as it might sound, it was probably a good thing that negotiations broke down.
Some of these things had to be discussed with other people and some on a one-to-one basis. That, in a sense, becomes a face-saving mechanism for those who know that they have to make a concession. It also makes people a lot more comfortable to know that I can speak honestly, I can show the other side what my real fears are without playing to the public gallery.
Those private communications created the opening for an outcome that was good for both. So if you're forming advice for other negotiators based on your experience, what sort of lessons? I take it the one is keep communication open.
Absolutely. That is the key in negotiations.
Build a working relationship even with those with whom you disagree.
Precisely.
And that takes time, I take it.
That takes time. It takes quite a lot of doing. But when that understanding finally comes about, it lays a very firm foundation for a solution or a settlement to be reached. A very firm one, because you're now speaking about real issues. You understand what the fears are, what the hopes are, and what the concerns are on the other side.
What did Cyril Sayer do that you thought was effective in this negotiation process that went on for months and years, in fact? Most negotiations, you never get a chance to hear the other person saying what you did that was useful.
I think it's very important to have the ability to rather listen than to speak. I think a good negotiator have to understand what the other side is saying and to get really behind what is being said.
I think the other important issue is also to concede the weakness of your own case, where having been mandated, instructed to put forward a particular argument, and through persuasion from the other side, you realize that you do not have a case to actually concede. That also helps in as far as building trust.
How were you able to put fresh ideas on the table without becoming committed to them?
You would say, well, this is an idea that came up in my mind, but I haven't checked with my colleagues yet, so what would be your reaction to that? If I could get acceptance of this idea, is there any chance that you might be able to take it forward?
There would be the formal open mandate, and there would also be another mandate which allows you a little bit of scope to explore and to also understand the thinking on the other side so that you can match it with yours and find common ground. When we were negotiating the release of prisoners, particularly those who were on death row, we wanted them released now, immediately. But we had to explore a number of options.
The power to explore options in a free-form style without immediately committing their party leadership often led to creative solutions when formal negotiations resumed. Take the case of the most difficult core issues, power sharing versus majority rule, and how to divide authority between the central government and the regions.
At first they wanted simple majority rule. In other words, where a majority party after the election with a simple majority would be able to govern the country.
I mean, imagine people who jailed Mandela, people who banned the ANC, people who were the overlords over apartheid legislation and everything, to sit with them in the same government was unheard of. It was never even thought of.
We originally started with the idea of having a so-called presidency of the leaders of the main three parties in the country together to form collectively the presidency of the country.
There was near revolt in the ranks. Our people had been mobilized over the years to believe that the struggle against apartheid meant winning a majority, uprooting the apartheid rulers from their positions and installing those who would have been legitimately elected by the people, who would essentially be ANC. That was the main thrust. That was the orientation. That was what propelled all of us.
We succeeded in getting across the understanding that if that is going to be the case, we will not be able to have a settlement in the country, simply for the fact that there was this need to have a transitional period, to get cooperation between the different communities in the country, and that could only be and best be achieved through the concept of a government of national unity.
Understanding the interests at stake made expanding the options more acceptable. As ANC leaders understood how deeply whites feared giving up power, and as the ANC realized they had no civil service ready to run a new government, they were able to consider the option of forming a partnership government, at least on a transitional basis.
When we decided on the concept of a government of national unity, we were in a way reaching out to those white people and saying we can work together, we can build this country together, we can forge ahead into the future together as one nation. It was born out of a very deep understanding of how those on the other side thought and felt.
The notion of power sharing, however, was the toughest issue for the ANC to sell to its own constituency.
But when we couched it as a government of national unity, and when we also said it is a government of national unity that has a limited lifespan, it became easier to sell. Our people accepted.
On the issue of how to divide power between the federal government and the regions, leaders of both parties looked to other countries for a standard.
The ANC was very negative about this idea of devolving power to the regions. So this was one of the main obstacles, and from our side it was a very important thing that we should, at least in the first constitution already, get agreement on this.
We used many. We looked at the US Constitution, we looked at the German Constitution, the Canadian Constitution, a number of African constitutions, and our positions were developed after studying and going through a whole number of constitutions. And we also had experts who were advising us on what would work best in a conflict-ridden society like ours.
When de Klerk in his inaugural address began the transition process, he certainly had not intended to relinquish power to the black majority. But in the end, the National Party came out a winner as well.
Because for so many years also the white community in this country was restricted, was due to apartheid, restricted from going around in the world. We became isolated, and suddenly, but even more so, in our own country we became isolated because we were standing in a corner. Because that surrendering of power would not have meant that we would disappear from the scene. That not only the white community will be part of the new South Africa, but that we will in fact be liberated ourselves in the process.
The negotiations gave birth to a new nation constitutionally and in spirit. South Africans have chosen Nelson Mandela as their first democratically elected president. De Klerk and another former ANC official serve as deputy presidents. This government of national unity will be in place for 5 years, after which simple majority rule will take over.
I was so proud to vote because it was for the first time for us to vote and we were fighting for this freedom. But we feel we got it.
Today, Mandela is pressing an intense campaign of reconstruction and development, seeking to improve housing, education, employment, and health care for all South Africans.
We are now dealing with the normal problems that many countries have to deal with. And more people are realizing that to have moved out of the horror of apartheid into this democratic dispensation was a miracle. And the next miracle is to make the government of national unity survive and be effective. And it is being effective.
I'm optimistic. I'm happy with South Africa as it is at the moment. I'm quite happy with the changes.
Both blacks and whites have to learn each other's cultures or the way of life. I think it is getting well. It is going there.
You're optimistic for the future?
Yes, I am, of course.
Now, actually, we know what we are doing, where we are going. We can see things happening, changes. We can see a lot of things changing now.
Such hopes do not erase the fact that South Africa remains a nation of stark contrasts, cultural and racial, rural and urban, rich and poor. But it is also a country that is united to solve its problems and negotiate its differences.
There are negotiations right across the country on a whole range of issues, from education to health, and all these are taking place in communities, rural communities, urban communities. So you could say that South Africans are a nation of negotiators. And that is what is so beautiful about this country. The beauty of the negotiation process has really caught fire in this country.
Whether you are negotiating a business deal, settling a labor dispute, reorganizing a school system in a city, or negotiating a new government as in South Africa, 5 basic skills are of utmost importance. Relationship. Build a working relationship with those with whom you're dealing, no matter how much you disagree. Work with them side by side. Communication. Communicate both ways. You cannot influence someone unless you understand and talk to them. Clarify their interests. What do they care about? What do you care about? Find the underlying interest both for yourself and for the other side. Invent options. Invent options without commitment. Find a lot of possible ways of meeting those fundamental interests. Finally, look for and use external standards to decide which option is the best one. As you get better and better at using these 5 skills, you will get better and better results in every negotiation. Thanks for joining us. I'm Roger Fisher.